This all happened back in the mid-90s. I grew up in a small community consisting of a few small towns. In one of these small towns, there was a single abandoned building, which us local kids referred to as the Crow Castle. It wasn't a weird building or anything, just abandoned and kind of old, maybe late 60s. We had no idea why it was abandoned, and as kids, we made up all kinds of stories for it. One kid said there'd been a lady who lived there, but who got eaten by her own cats. Another said that it had burned down, but mysteriously rebuilt itself overnight. There were all kinds of stories. At a sleepover party with a few of my friends, the Crow Castle was discussed once again. But this time, something was different. One of us said that, yes, there was a lady, and another said that, yes, the lady lived alone. She'd had a baby, but she didn't want it, so she burned it in a ceramic stove in the back of the building, then killed herself in one of the local industry blast furnaces. This was way too specific for a bunch of kids. We had no idea about different types of ovens, and few of us had ever even been in the industrial area. Still, we all agreed on this story to be the one and true story. She was alone, she had a baby, she burned the baby, and then killed herself. Our curiosity got the better of us, and we decided we had to know for ourselves. As the adults thought that we had all gone to sleep, we sneaked out around midnight to check out the Crow Castle for ourselves. There were 5 of us in total, each with our own flashlight. The Crow Castle was this ordinary 2-story house, just a tad bit bigger than the other houses in the area. I remember the big, pale yellow drapes that covered the windows. No one ever dared to vandalize the Crow Castle, and I never understood why. The other kids would mess around with pretty much anything, but no one dared to touch the Crow Castle. We finally found an entrance through the basement. The house was old and had a wood-burning stove in the kitchen, which meant a big cellar for storing logs for the winter. There was a padlock, but it was old. We managed to pick it using a small screwdriver that the youngest of us had brought along for protection. We moved through the basement with little to no problems. We were all terrified, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. There were no logs or saved wood. The cellar was emptied out. The whole place rang hollow. We found the stairs to the kitchen. The stairs were really tight, and the floor was made of some really old linoleum. Had we just been a little taller, we would have had to crouch to get up at all. The kitchen was nothing special, but we spent at least an hour going through it in detail. The wood-burning stove was no big deal, just this big, ugly black metal thing in the middle of the room. We didn't bother to investigate it further. We went through the house room by room, each one empty. Our first scare came when a neighbor walked by. They must have thought they had heard something and were yelling at anyone in there to come out. Of course we didn't. Instead, we hid and waited for them to leave. Eventually, they did. Finally, we got to the last room on the first floor, the study. There was a big wooden door leading up to it. As we entered, the first thing we saw took us completely by surprise. In the corner was a big ceramic stove. Right next to it was an old, worn desk. We checked that out first. The drawers were locked, and we couldn't manage to get them open with the screwdriver. We didn't want to break it, so we decided to move on and check out the ceramic stove. I was standing right behind him when he opened it. As he did, we heard this odd whooshing noise, like there was some kind of suction. It sounded like an air raid siren, but heard from far away. A few seconds later, a cloud of black soot burst from the stove. The kid in the front got most of it on him. It got in his eyes and he started wailing. I got some on my legs, and when I tried to rub it off, I just ended up spreading it out with my hands. The noise got louder as the obstruction cleared out, so we just closed the thing. I'd never been so scared. And that's when we noticed there wasn't just ash on the floor. Newspaper cutouts. At least 30 pictures from newspapers and magazines, all depicting infants. Those scrunched up, toothless little infants, screaming, crying, sleeping. All kinds of pictures of them. Most of the pictures were covered in soot, but some were clear as day. The biggest kid started picking them up, but we yelled at him to drop them. He did, and we ran. We never talked about that night again. To us, the story had been proven real, and we were done with it. We tried to ask the adults if there had been a woman who'd killed herself in the blast furnaces. They didn't want to talk about it. They didn't want to talk to kids about suicide. It was too morbid. One of the town drunks did, though. He didn't care. He told us that, indeed, there had been a woman who'd killed herself in a blast furnace. She'd had an affair with a man who had been working there, and when he left her, she killed herself. They'd found her clothes by the side of the blast furnace, covered in soot.